James, thanks very much for joining us. I wanted to drill down a little bit with you in terms of the rescue package that the European Union has come up with. There's been very little analysis of that, and I just wanted to get your take on it.
Europe's leaders concluded it was, I think, the longest summit between the member states, possibly ever. It was 4 days of arduous negotiations in Brussels, and the end result was to unite behind this recovery fund designed to support member states' economic recovery post-pandemic. And it is a genuinely landmark moment. I know that's an often used expression for people in my profession, but in this case, the noun is possibly justified because it binds the EU bloc together into a tighter fiscal union through issuing common debt to the tune of about 750 billion euros. And this is issued at the EU level, so that's what makes it landmark. It's never been done before. So it's perhaps actually, to sort of unpack this, it's probably best to look at what has happened in terms of the construction and meaning of this fund, which has been called the Next Generation EU Fund, in terms of what it means for member states, economies, and obviously the trickle-down effect into real estate markets, into 3 categories: the good, the bad, possibly the ambiguous.
Let's start with the positive news first, James. So just talk us through the good.
Obviously, it's the fund itself to get it stepping behind it. All the 27 member states, it shows solidarity at a time of acute crisis, which, of course, this crisis still has the potential to be economically more severe than the global financial crisis. And so it could cement and accelerate the already existing wealth divide between the northern and southern European member states. So this agreement symbolizes a bridge between the conflicting priorities between the richer and the poorer EU member states. The so-called Frugal Four, which are Austria, Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands, were vehemently against debt mutualization. So, and what that means essentially is jointly issuing debt via the capital markets under the EU's overall creditworthiness. And so this has the effect of vastly lowering debt costs for countries which have been most severely affected by the pandemic, such as Spain, Italy, and France. All of those member states in the southern European bracket that are already the weaker economic countries, and they struggled the most with the GFC, and they were most severely hit by COVID. And they already have, if you like, as one metric, is their GDP to debt ratios is already way above 100%. That means that for countries like those, and obviously Greece as well, their borrowing costs are so much higher. And so to centralize the issuance of debt allows those economically already worse hit to get the advantage of lower debt costs at a time when they absolutely need it. I mean, think about it, it's a bit of a cruel irony that the economic weaker countries were also the most severely affected by the pandemic. So that just accelerates their economic woes. So hence, solidarity is in that case justified. It's also been agreed at the same time that the next 7-year EU budget has been ratified. And that's something just under 1.1 trillion euros over 7 years. And so together, these two agreements signify, if you like, at least in the medium term, a receded risk of any further euro fragmentation. So that's another real positive. And just quickly, in terms of the final bits of good news on the EU budget itself, which of course excludes the UK now, it's the bloc's greenest ever budget, and there is an emphasis on prioritising EU's climate goals, reducing carbon emissions, investment in the electronic automobile sector, as well as lots of other sustainable technologies. So there's lots there that are positives, but it isn't all good news.
That's the positive sides of it. What do you see as the kind of bad? And you also mentioned then there were some sort of elements of uncertainty, really.
The initial reaction to it obviously was kind of like the markets reacted very positively that there'd been some agreement, and obviously they had an effect of seeing the euro strengthen against the dollar. There was a bounce in a lot of European equity markets, but that quickly gave way to a sobering reality, actually, when a lot of the member states and the EU itself has provided second quarter GDP figures. And the EU level just being published, and they were as bad as expected. It's minus 12.1%, and that follows minus 3.6% for Q1. So, we're running at sort of minus 15% so far H1. So the fact is that even including this stimulus package, the recovery is going to be slow. It's going to be very uneven. It's going to vary by sectors, even with the stimulus package. And I suppose the chief concern I have about the stimulus package in terms of what we know will be difficult is the time it will take to raise the proceeds and then to allocate it to member states, and for member states to put in place a system by which that will be disseminated to corporates and to households in whichever way that's happened. And so I mean, some have said several months. I mean, I don't think we fully know yet. So it kind of creates a bit of a time lag. It's which needs to be plugged. A lot of these companies and households still are unable to work. Some are slowly starting to go back. Companies are sort of, still trying to work out the difference between, like, previous demand pre-COVID, near-term demand that they can kind of meet now, how much demand has permanently gone, how much temporarily left, what that means for their ability to kind of keep staff on or rehire staff that have let go. So there's this kind of state which is going to probably last for a while in terms of meeting short-term liquidity requirements, getting access to the capital, on what basis are companies given access to capital, and if actually there's going to be a second wave, then all bets are off in terms of how that will pan out over the long term. So the near-term liquidity crisis continues, and that kind of shows that the fates of companies' supply chains, their employees, are all intertwined. So government furlough schemes will still need to support certain companies in the near term, and there's going to be a wide divergence in the degree to which they'll be able to return to work. And I suppose looking at the sort of structure of the fund itself, it's divided into grants and loans. And so the 750 billion euros is the headline figure. And I think it's 390 billion in grants. So that's to countries and nations that effectively don't have to pay it back. That was actually scaled back initially from 500 billion due to the frugal four. And the balance is going to be given in, I think, low interest loans. And the way in which individual country allocations will be defined is linked to GDP and unemployment trend forecasts. Now, they're not defined yet. And so actually countries and member states, EU member states, don't yet know how much they're going to get. They know which ones are most likely to get it, but they don't know the amounts. So in terms of their planning, it's still a little bit difficult. But it is designed to help those most severely affected. And so it's not just those with the biggest cases of COVID and obviously the greatest mortality rates, but it's also some of those countries that are not directly affected by the health crisis of COVID, but they're so dependent on tourism, such as countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain, that they're going to be affected indirectly as a result of the kind of the lack of, or the much slower international travel for holidays, and kind of the reduced sort of appetite for people to go on holidays abroad. So allocations are not yet known, and national planning is tricky. What the official line is that 70% of the fund will be allocated next year and the year after, and then the balance 30% will be in 2023. But some economists have sort of cast some doubt over that, and actually think that it will take far longer for money to be dispersed. It will be over many more years. And so this moves us into the ambiguous kind of area of kind of like, we don't know how quickly it will take for the money to reach nations and for nations to disseminate it to companies and households, and the judicious use of those proceeds. One of the acrimonious problems in actually getting to the agreement was to have sort of sufficient checks and balances on how countries were using these grants and loans. And they wanted to have some sort of ability to kind of pause nations' ability to use these grants if it was felt that they weren't being used in a fit and proper sort of way. In order to come to agreements, in the end, this 4-day marathon set of discussions, some of these kind of checks and balances that you really would want in place were removed. So this is a kind of, this reduces the EU's oversight capacity to ensure that net proceeds are being fairly used. And there's, in addition to that, it's almost inevitable that separate to that, this is the EU, there's going to be some bureaucratic use and wastefulness And that's kind of inevitable. And so the system for distribution of EU grants and loans into companies and households overall is unclear. And it's not just the EU. I mean, we can see this in actually the UK as well. It's not about comparable. So if you remember our bounce back loan scheme, which came after the Sybil schemes for small and then large companies, the bounce back loan scheme was the more recent iteration, which was 100% backed by the UK government, and that also required far less proof by companies of their ability to repay. And this allowed that money to be disseminated by the clearing banks in the UK far, far more quickly. They didn't even have to give things like particularly robust justifications of revenues and profits and forecasts and things like that. So it opens up to a degree of moral hazard. Companies can apply for grants and loans, and potentially these proceeds could be used unethically to shore up potentially already failing businesses that might have collapsed already. It might just allow certain sort of poorly managed companies to kick the can down the road. And so in the UK, we went light touch because we were in a moment of emergency, and that might happen in the EU. It's not to say that it will, but with fewer checks and balances, where there was room to exploit a situation, companies and individuals and management teams often do, at least some do. So we're in this sort of overall, and to summarize, we're in this sort of situation that if the EU did nothing, they would have been pilloried. If the EU kind of just locked into stalemate because of some of these disagreements, some of which are justified, they would have been criticised for not acting fast enough. If they conceded too much oversight ground, which some might say that they have, they might in the future be judged harshly for like profligate use of taxpayers' money. So they were in this kind of political situation which required them to choose between the least bad options, and to choose so quickly. And so it's so nuanced, and really what they've really tried to do is just to kind of just emphasize the solidarity and pat themselves on the back, and not really kind of warn of the dangers that lie ahead with all these billions of euros that is over the next few years is going to be possibly disseminated quickly, under strain, with little oversight.
Great. Thanks very much, James. Always good to get your analysis on these kind of evolving but quite complex pictures. So thanks very much for joining us.